Hey Alejandro, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Patrick?
Good. It's good to have you back. Thanks for doing this.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So the last time we spoke, we had a really interesting conversation about Panama and El Salvador. So let's definitely get into them again. But before we do, just tell me, what's new with you? What's new at MMG Bank in Panama? How have things been?
Awesome. Everything has been great, honestly. It's been an eventful year. The bank has been doing great. I think our base of clients have been growing more, even though, the recent jitters with Panama and Trump and whatnot. But a lot of money from South America and Central America has been flowing back to Panama.
Mm.
It's been a magnet from just foreign inflows that do not necessarily want to be in the US, but want to be invested in the dollar. Panama is a great second source, it's also closer. So everything has been great. Assets have been growing pretty well. Clients have been pretty happy. And obviously, markets have been pretty good overall. And EM markets have been doing actually really good. 2023 was a good year. 2024 was a great year. And 2025 has been seeing a lot of strong inflows into everything that's emerging market credit. And obviously that flows into Latin America too.
Yeah. So the last time we spoke, the big story in Panama was the Cobre copper mine, right? So maybe we'll start there. And what's going on with that? The last time we spoke, the government had shut it down. It was like 1% of global copper production or something like that. Is the mine still closed?
That is correct. The mine is still closed, actually. To give you a little bit more context, elections happened last year in Panama. President Molino won election. I think a resounding popular vote. We don't have a second round in Panama. It's just one round. He won close to 40% of the popular vote. We don't have an electoral college, so it's just a popular vote. So that was a pretty strong base. Obviously, he had almost like two-thirds of the country that didn't vote for him, so that sort of creates a strange environment. But I think the presidency has been pretty good for everybody. He has to deal with two different issues right now. First one is the Social Security law that he's enacting. We're doing Social Security and pension reforms. We can talk about it after. And then after that, for 2025, he wants to spearhead a new negotiation with the mine. So it's still closed. That's the long answer, but the short answer is still closed. I didn't go into contraction last year, surprisingly. It still grew. The economy still grew, but it has affected the overall economy. Unemployment went up from around 6% to almost 10%. So,
Okay.
not great news.
So the mine then is still a major political issue. It's an ongoing debate.
I would say it's an issue more on the populist side
Mm.
because, and especially now, I don't know how this whole thing with Trump is going to affect, but a lot of, especially unions, use as the mine as like the foreign entity exploiting
Yeah,
or
yeah.
exploiting Panamanian resources. And I think that was the rhetoric before. Now I think people have seen the impact on the economy, and I think people are slowly backtracking. There's still no consensus for the reopening. People want to see. I think what's going to happen is more transparency in what's going on. But overall, I think it's going to lean up to an opening. I don't know if it's going to be like a renegotiation on the terms. Arbitrage is still happening as we speak, though.
Okay.
That's the lawsuit between Cobre Panama and the country.
Yeah. You mentioned last time too that it's not just a matter of shutting down the mine and leaving it. It's a significant cost for security and just to have the mine there. So it's a negative on the budget. Is that right still?
That is correct. And also, they've been finding more and more illegal mining operations. So
Yeah.
part of the whole how it all works is you want the operation to be regulated, but also the mine has like a vested interest for people to not be doing like illegal mining operations around it. It's dangerous for everybody. But now, since there's no large enterprise supervising the area, and people know there's precious metals in the area because with copper comes gold, now there's popping up more and more illegal mining operations, which obviously isn't good for the country.
Which or the company, right? Everybody loses.
Everybody loses. And I think two good cases, El Salvador, which we'll speak after, is actually trying to come back because they now found huge reservoirs of mining metals. But they have a moratorium. Panama also have a moratorium now, so they would have to repeal that law.
Mm.
And Costa Rica actually wants to go back and start doing legal mining again. So I think those two countries are showing the roadmap of what Panama is going to have to do this year.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential. I mean, I follow Nicaragua's largest gold miner. It's public, Caliber Mining.
Okay.
And you just get the impression that it's so widely underexplored. They don't really invest that much money in drilling, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if you get these lifts on more moratoriums and you start to see investment in Central America if they just find a ton of natural resources.
100% agreed. Actually, well, Panama shares the border with Costa Rica, and next to the border, there's a bunch of, let's call it like gold mine reservoirs or proven reserves. So in theory, you should also have those in Costa Rica. It's the same terrain, so it should be the same, right? And I think Costa Rica also has potential gold mines next to Panama. But again, right now, it's mostly illegal gold mining happening in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a huge export of gold, just nobody knows where it's coming from.
Right, right. So the other story then, I guess, is the pension reform you mentioned.
Yes.
So is that what's in focus economically in Panama at the moment? Before we talk about the canal, because obviously that's that's a different news story. But in terms of the debate or what's been going on over the past several months, it's pension reform.
Yes, 100%. To give you a little bit of context, present value of future liabilities is around $75 billion, which is around Panama's GDP. A little bit smaller though, but it's a huge liability, right? As the classic example where there's a defined benefit pension, just like it happened to all European countries, Latin America or South American countries, you have these huge liabilities. Your demographics do not support the old workers. So when the pension system was created, it was for every new or retiring employee, there were 6 new employees coming into the workforce. And now it's for every retiring employee, there's around 2 new employees coming into the workforce. So the math just doesn't add up. They're going to have to do this reform. And that's going to, if they don't do anything, it's going to cost around 3% of GDP, which is a huge number. So they need to do a reform. I think the government is proposing to put from taxes around $1 billion a year just to cover the shortfall of the operating shortfall. But they want to increase, obviously, both your retirement age and your payouts. And obviously, that's not popular, right? So that's been, I think, taking the focus for the government, and that's why they haven't moved into the mine.
Okay. And when you only have 40% of the popular vote, it's pretty hard to start peeling back benefits and paying people out less money, right?
This is a hugely unpopular movement right now, and they don't have majority in Congress. So they need to somehow rally up support from other parties. There's an independent party that has a large. No party has a majority. There's a large independent bloc, and I think they've been trying to do the right thing, but I think they've been moving a little bit more. They're more like, let's call them like the Instagram generation. So they are going for the likes and whatnot. So it's difficult for a congressman or a congress member or a member of Congress to do this stuff, right? You're basically kind of voting yourself out of re-election because people are going to remember, oh, he increased my retirement age. Oh, he increased the amount of money that I need to shove out just for my retirement.
Yeah, it's difficult. So how do you think it gets resolved then? Do you think eventually they get something through in 2025, but it's going to have a bunch of, earmarks and, weird spending? Everyone's going to get their little pet project in the bill, or do you think nothing gets passed?
No, I do think something's going to get passed. Something has to get passed. Right now, the law doesn't allow the government to transfer money into the retirement system. So you are going to run out of funds somehow, like somewhere like in February or March of this year, which means you wouldn't have enough money to pay out retired people, their pensions, their monthly pensions. So something will need to get resolved. I think by the end of Q1, it will get resolved. And this is gathering a lot of attention from rating agencies, which are basically asking Panama to do a pension reform. This has been a focus from Moody's, from Fitch, from S&P. People are very worried about if Panama will get it passed, and I think it will get passed. They've just agreed on the first block. It's around 200 articles in the law. The first 50, I think, are already agreed upon. They're moving on blocks. So the first block is done. They're moving into the second block, which is going to do more with the economics.
Okay. Interesting. So
slowly but surely.
Yeah. So what about Panamanian assets then? I mean, where should investors be looking if they want to invest in Panama? Bonds, equities, real estate. I mean, what's attractive, what's unattractive at the moment in Panama?
I think so. Let's go macro to micro. The sovereign debt, I think there's going to be a trade there. But I think for the patient investor, going to have to wait a little bit more. I think spreads will widen a little bit more. Maybe things will get more jittery with Trump and whatnot. But I think there's a trade's going to happen there, and we're just waiting for spreads to move a little bit more. I think when yields hit around 8% on the 32s, I think that's a buy signal. The 2032s from the Panama debt. Once around 8%, I think that's a clear buy because the government will do, I think, fiscally, they will be much more responsible at previous administration. Locally, we still like some companies that we still follow. We actually publish research on them. For example, you still have large banks, insurance companies, some operating companies that are shelling out maybe around or paying out maybe around 6% dividends. They're growing double-digit clips. The issue with that is you're going to have local access because everything's listed in the local stock exchange. One of our main trade ideas for 2025 is actually the short part of the curve, the corporate credit curve in locally. So it pays out for great issuers around maybe 150 to 200 basis points spread increase compared to what you find in the US in the short part of the curve. So you'll get great yield with very low volatility and very low risk. And I think those are our main ideas. Real estate, we're not doing that much. The real estate market in Panama is a little challenged right now. There was just a lot of over construction. So I think it just needs to digest out of the economy.
Yeah, you mentioned over construction. I saw a stat the other day that kind of blew my mind. Is Panama City, it's got like one of the most high rises in the Western Hemisphere of all cities or something? Like,
I think it has the most high rises in Latin America.
Yeah, I don't know if it's first or second, but it's some absurd statistic.
And
in
it
terms
has
of high rises.
a lot of the tallest high rises, actually.
Yeah. So a lot of that was overbuilt. I guess there was a building boom, 10, 20 years ago?
I would say between 2014 and 2019 or 2020, 2009 to 2014, I'm sorry. That was a huge construction boom. Panama was growing almost double digits, right? Huge construction boom. And we had, which I know will stick out after, we had the first inflow of Venezuelans coming to Panama, and they were just buying everything that they could. Sort of what happened to Miami now, right?
I was going to ask if it had to do with like the zero interest rates or the very low interest rates in dollar at the time, but no, you said it was more just Venezuelans coming and they needed housing.
That is correct. They would just buy everything that they had in their hands. There was a huge influx of just foreigners coming to Panama. And Panama was maybe seen as like a little speculative bubble because prices were going up, would just buy property just to sell it after, or just buy it for residence. And I think now we're doing the overhand, kind of like what China is happening right now, where they're trying to deflate prices slow by slow. That's happening in Panama.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So I guess let's talk about the canal then. The Panama Canal, the Chinese Canal, the American Canal. Depends on what news source you're reading these days. But maybe just explain the current state of the canal as you see it, and then we'll talk a bit about, the Trump debate or whatever's going on with it.
Sure. To give you a little bit of local context, we first heard the news or Trump talking about it. And our first reaction was, he's galvanizing his base. He's talking to his base. Like, it's just, he wasn't the president yet. He was just the elected president or the president-elect. And I think it's different once you're president-elect to once you become president. It's different magnitude, right? Then that happened. And people were thinking he was just posturing, because Trump, I call him an agent of chaos. He's a chaos agent. He just creates chaos, and then he'll change his focus to something else, and then he'll change it back, and then he'll go and that's how he deals. So then after, once the inauguration speech, he actually talked with the canal people. Then we're now are thinking, oh, he's serious now, right? So the rumor is he's trying to negotiate some sort of immigration agreement with Panama to house or to keep immigrants or illegal immigrants in the US to just expatriate them back to Panama so that those can be repatriated back to their countries. So Panama would be like a bridge between illegal immigrants that have to be sent out of the US, right? And I think maybe negotiations haven't been going that well or as fast. And then as a classic Trump move, he'll bully you into a corner so you will say yes to whatever he wants to actually say yes. The backstory behind that whole thing. So I think he mentions the ports, which are managed by this company called Hutchinson. It's actually a British company from the British Virgin Islands that has its headquarters in Hong Kong. And that's where the whole Chinese company comes from. Because in
Okay.
theory, it's Chinese owned at the end. The parent company is Chinese owned.
I mean, but so are there a lot of like Chinese nationals actually working at the canal, or is the canal
No,
mostly
no,
managed
no,
by?
no, no foreigners working the canal. Only
Are there?
Panamanians working the canal.
It's all Panamanians, right? So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
Americans, it's not Colombians, it's run by Panamanians, Panamanian companies
That is correct. But and then the ports are also managed by Panamanians, but also you have like okay, it's a foreign entity that
holding
owns the
it,
port.
oh, foreign
Yeah,
holding company or whatever. So you think there's a trade aspect to it? You think he's trying to maybe negotiate better rates for American shipping or American products that come through Panama, some favorable trade terms compared to China? Or
so
you
I
think
don't
it's
think that's
mostly
viable.
immigration?
The U.S. doesn't have a merchant marine since forever. I think it's only a few ships, and I know because in the treaty, and I know this for a fact. U.S. warships get expedited pass through the canal because
Yep.
that's in the law basically. He might want to do something about the ports. Basically, that's a concession. The ports were given out in 1997. The concession from it's called Panama Ports Company. The concession was given out in 1997 when the Americans were still managing the Panama Canal Zone and the Panama Canal. There was a bunch of companies trying to gain the concession, and this Hutchinson company won. And actually, there was an American company that wanted to get the concession, but it didn't win it. The weird part is, well, it's been since 1997, the same company has been operating the ports. And I think I was listening Nito Cortizo. He was saying he talked to the U.S. administration and he in 2020 and he made it clear there were no Chinese involved in any of these. So I think this coming back from 2020. I don't quite know what the reports from the U.S. intelligence services say, but I think there's been rumbling since 2020 about an increase in Chinese influence. I just don't understand where that's coming from.
Okay. Interesting. So how do you think it gets resolved then? You mentioned Marco Rubio is going to be in Panama this coming Saturday. We're recording on January 28th. So what do you think gets discussed? What do you think actually happens and which just rhetoric?
I think they will negotiate some sort of, the repatriation deal for illegal immigrants from in the U.S. And I think that's going to be the main focus. It's immigration. I think Trump, in part, was elected for immigration, whatever happened in the southern border and huge influx of immigrants that the U.S. have had. So I think that's going to be a key discussion. I don't think also, and I don't see viable that let's call them U.S. ships will get a preferential rate. Rate is actually set in a very transparent process, and I think a bunch of shipping companies sit down and have a say at it. So I don't see that as fully viable, and I don't think so. But I do think immigration and security, border security, is going to be taking a huge centerpiece. Also, Panama doesn't really export anything. So the whole tariffs, I mean, it wouldn't really work with Panama because Panama doesn't really export anything. We usually export a lot of copper. Now it doesn't.
Right.
But it's mostly fruits, a little bit of beef, but Panama is a service economy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess most people might not understand how important Panama and Colombia are to this immigration debate, right? Because there's the Darien Gap, where the only highway that goes from the south of Argentina all the way up through Alaska isn't connected, right? So that's like an immigration hub because anyone coming up from South America has to somehow cross the Darien Gap, which either you go through the jungle in Colombia or you take a boat through the San Blas Islands, right? And then you end up in Panama after a nice Caribbean boat trip. But yeah, so Panama's crucial. But I guess what you're telling me is that you think he's negotiating like a outsourced prison, outsourced detention agreement. So they'll be able to fly anybody that's detained and deported from the United States would theoretically go to maybe a Panamanian, or I've heard El Salvador might be in discussions too. You think maybe Central America is getting an outsourced detention center industry?
I think so. And if you think about, the whole human rights, how much oversight there's going to be for this, I think it's going to be more flexible, to be candid about it, to have those in Panama or El Salvador than the oversight or the scrutiny that you're going to have if you have those in Texas, I don't know, Arizona. But I do think it's going to be very centered and focused on immigration and these outsourced detention centers that it looks like Trump wants to set up.
And it could be you mentioned before we started speaking, it's not a small amount of money for Panama's economy or El Salvador's economy, right? You said before we spoke, 4 billion is the number they're throwing around. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, that's a rumor. It's going to be around 4 billion because it's more than just a detention center, right? It's going to be let's call it like an airport
Yep.
just to the landing and takeoff for these special flights. It's going to be the whole infrastructure. It's also going to be, if it, as they say, is going to happen in Darien, most likely going to be with some sort of U.S. oversight of whoever is coming into Panama. Right now, there's a lot of collaboration between the Panamanian Border Patrol and the U.S., let's call it like U.S. security forces, where everybody that's coming into Panama is actually getting vetted and they check everybody. The thing before was Panama was just passing them up north. Everybody would just pass them up north. All these illegal immigrants, they would just get to Mexico. They would cross the border. And I think they might be starting to stop them in Panama, have them in the detention center, just like they did in the U.S. But before they get to the U.S., I think the U.S. might want to start in Panama like a new wall and detain these immigrants in Panama and then repatriate them back to their countries. And I think this is going to be a huge focus of that visit.
Yeah,
it's more than the canal. It's more about internal security, but in another way. It's not like geopolitical war. Security is more about this immigration security or insecurity that's been happening.
Yeah. So I guess it's a perfect segue into our next country I wanted to ask you about, which is El Salvador, because they got quite famous for, cleaning up their gang problems and creating this new prison complex. And from what I understand, security has improved. Homicide rates are way down. El Salvador is much, 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 much safer than it was 5 years ago. So they would seem like another candidate that knows how to do that and could maybe be a partner.
So I was just in El Salvador last year. I went there a couple of times for work mostly. Before in El Salvador, you couldn't go out, right? So you would you would land there. Somebody would pick you up. Most cars were secured vehicles. You would be driven to your hotel, and then you would go to your hotel, to restaurants, or to your offices or whatever, and then that would be it. You would never walk around. Now the whole story is being radically changed. I think, like I mentioned before, the first term for Bukele was a security term, and he did it, right? He decreased the criminality rate and the murder rate by 96%. So it's crazy. And before, you couldn't cross neighborhoods. So if you were in X neighborhood and you went to go to Y neighborhood and it was controlled by different gangs, you couldn't go to that neighborhood. You would be shot or murdered or whatever. Now it's much, it's radically safe. You can just walk around with your phone now. Nothing happens. It's very, very safe. The second term is going to be economic. So they secured the IMF deal, which is around $1.4 billion. He's actually been really careful about repaying back debt. The trade there, I think, in my opinion, is gone. I think the cat is out of the hat.
Because when we last spoke, you highlighted a huge discount on El Salvador sovereign bonds, and that's closed now, right? Their debt situation is resolved, and I think people believe in the story now too, right? They kind of trust Bukele is going to be economically prudent.
For example, their long bonds, which is the 54s, I believe, those were trading around 30 cents on the dollar. Now they're trading 106. So, it was probably one of the best trades of 2024.
Yep. Also dollar denominated, right? Because they're a dollarized
economy. Denominated. That is correct. So now the next question is, he's been very prudent about the finances, but the issue that he's having now is there's no enough private investment to push growth, right? Because when you think about it, you're going to have public spending, private consumption, and then private investments. So public spending has to be tempered down. He cannot run huge deficits because he has to adhere to everything the IMF has asked from him. And I think also it is worth mentioning, he made a huge bet on Trump. That was, the guy, if he was a gambling man, he just put everything to the red and Trump won. And now he's reaping the benefits. I believe he's going to reap some benefits. And I think there should be a lot of collaboration between the U.S. and El Salvador. Just because of how close he is to administration.
Yeah, he's wildly popular. Even among outside of Central America, Latin America, with the Bitcoin people, he's a global celebrity for sure at this point.
He is actually. A lot of people in countries, they just say, we just want to Bukele.
Yeah,
Colombia, you go to Costa Rica, you go to Panama, they will tell you, we just want to Bukele. That's all.
Or a Milei. People say, I'm the Milei candidate or I'm the Bukele candidate, right? Depending on if it's inflation or crime, right?
Yeah,
I'm trying to find
that is correct.
So what did you make of the IMF package then? Do you think El Salvador got a decent deal? I think a lot of people, maybe the crypto community, was kind of surprised. What are you doing taking IMF debt? But do you think they made a good deal?
I think so. It had to happen. He had to rely on that amount of money for them to be able to not default. And as a reminder, a lot of the debt is owned by the local pension funds. So
Right.
you have to think about if he defaults on the debt, he would be defaulting on people's pensions.
Yep.
Which think about Panama, it's kind of the same
Same
logic, right?
thing.
You would be touching. I mean, he would be
No one.
hugely unpopular. He could
Yeah.
not default. He had to come to the table to whatever terms they agreed upon. I mean, this had to happen. But now what I was saying was this term is going to be about investments. This is the part that I'm uncertain. Money is not flowing into the country for capital investments, and I think that's where he might have issues for the next term because he needs to push up the economic growth. And the way he is going to have to do it is doing investment. Economic growth is actually going to, they're targeting at 2.5%. He wanted to reach between 4 and 5, which is far away from what realistically he's going to achieve. And he needs private money to flow back into the country and to be invested in the country. And I think that's going to be a large hurdle for 2025. And the last one is going to be everything that's going to have to be with the flow of just funds being sent from the US, because around a fifth of the economy is just money being sent back from the US to El Salvador.
Yeah,
So I
remittances,
don't know
right?
what's going to happen if people start getting deported, illegal immigrants. There must be, and I don't know the figure, but there must be a lot of illegal immigrants from El Salvador.
That's interesting. If
Yeah,
10% of the remittance money gets sent, the people actually get sent back to El Salvador, those flows are done. Right now, they're El Salvador employees, not U.S. employees.
exactly.
That's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that could be tough. So why do you think the private investment hasn't materialized then, right? Because we're well into the Bukele term. It's been safe for a few years. It seems like it's at least regionally one of the more attractive places at the moment to do business. You know, they're very pro-business administration. Why do you think the foreign investment, the direct investment hasn't materialized yet?
From speaking with people locally, you'll see two ideas or two Bukele sides, right? You have the security side, which everybody's really happy. I mean, he did what he did. Then there's a businessman that has XYZ corporation that
Yep.
does something in locally in Salvador, and he'll tell you, my issue right now is that you never know when he'll flip from being pro business or allowing you to do whatever you do to want to regulate you or change whatever rules or laws you're working by. So that there's some uncertainty because obviously, and this is no news, right? He controls the judiciary, he
Yeah.
controls the Congress. I mean, he controls all three branches of government. So that uncertainty, I think, makes people with or business owners to try to save money, but then stash them outside of El Salvador instead of reinvesting those back in Salvador. So he has to win that people's trust. How do you do that? You need to respect the rule of law, but then some news pop out that maybe not affect the 60% population that, if XYZ businessman goes to jail or is investigated or the IRS of El Salvador is investigating him from tax evasion because he said something against Bukele, it doesn't affect a huge swath of the population, but it might affect the certainty of the people with the capital to be put in place.
Yeah, it's a message to the people that are with $100,000 to reinvest in their business, and they see that and they go, maybe I just buy U.S. Treasuries in Miami, my Miami brokerage account, or I buy a condo in Argentina or something. Instead of taking this risk, I already have my business here. Why don't I diversify?
Exactly. And that's what's happening. They'll tell you, no, I'm going to send this $1 million, but I'm going to send it to Miami. I have a JP Morgan banker, or have Morgan Stanley banker. I'll just send those out. And I mean, I need to, because you never know. And they always talk about Venezuela. You never know when these things all flips and I have to leave the country. So that he needs to earn that trust. If he earns that trust, he'll have a second mandate of economic growth.
And then the foreign investment hasn't materialized. I guess there hasn't been a cohort of like American investors that love the El Salvador story that have. I mean, there's not that many instruments, right? Like you mentioned the sovereign bonds. I went through their stock market a few years ago, and there's really not very many companies. There's a bunch of foreign banks with listings there, but I think of like operating companies like 4 or 5. So there really aren't many stocks to pick from. Bukele himself said in an interview, their real estate market's in a bubble because they haven't been able to build enough. So if you wanted to invest in Salvador, where do you invest?
That is a good question. Yeah, their market is very, very small. And actually, for example, they're very small, like a very limited number of issuers. But you see like financial companies, or you see like a bank,
Scotia
like a
Bank,
regional bank, a Scotia Bank or a bank. I think Scotia Bank now though is selling that Salvadorian assets to Da Vivienda. But
Okay.
you see these corporate issuers that have more regional presence, and they'll have like a local operations, and they'll issue like corporate debt. And as you mentioned, real estate market has been a huge focus because what's been happening is a lot of people that left El Salvador, they've been working in the US, maybe they legalized their status, maybe they saved up some money. Now they're moving back to El Salvador. But they may be not moving to live there, but they might come back and they'll buy an apartment, they'll buy a house. They call them the distant cousins. That's what they call them in local.
Okay.
And it's that cousin that left 20 years ago. He made a living in the US. He saved money in the US, but now he has 200, 300, $150,000, and he wants to invest those. He has some money stashed in the US, but he's going to buy an apartment in El Salvador. So as you mentioned, prices have gone up significantly in real estate in El Salvador. That's been a great, for whoever bought that early, it's been a great source of return.
Yeah, the repatriation one, the people going back to El Salvador is interesting because Bukele's highlighted that too. And it's kind of the opposite of what everyone's talking about at the moment in the news of the forced deportations. But El Salvador's been dealing with citizens coming back in reasonable numbers for a few years now, right?
That is correct. Not all of them come back and live, but they come back and visit, which also is a good benefit for the economy. It's just hasn't been enough to offset, what I was talking before.
Yeah. So what else about El Salvador then? Is there any other major news, or it's kind of covered it? It's a tough market to find investments in.
It is a tough market. And I think the big thing was the sovereign debt, but it's gone now.
Yeah. I mean, I saw he announced a program this week, maybe, that they're going to give away 5,000 passports to foreigners that want to live in El Salvador that are, doctors, scientists, which is one way to bring in some foreign investments. People like second passports, especially if you're in a country where you don't necessarily like the politics at the moment. I think a lot of smart people might take a chance on that. I'd take it if they pick me. If they want to give me an El Salvador passport, I'd buy a beach house and move there. But but yeah, I don't know. We'll see. It's an interesting story to follow, but unfortunately not very investable practically at the moment. It's not that easy to find. Especially for
There's just a lot of PR.
Like of course. He's a master. PR. He's so good at Twitter. He's very, very good. As one of the first politicians, Trump did it effectively, but he really mastered it and created this whole brand and image, and kudos. I mean, it's been a benefit to the country for sure. It's a positive thing 100%. In my opinion. Because he kind of pioneered the transparency too. I mean, he speaks very directly to the world about what he's doing. Yeah. And you don't really like it or dislike it, but at least it's transparent. You know what's going on. So I guess let's touch again. We've mentioned it when we talked about Panama. We talked about El Salvador a bit. But so what's going on in Venezuela then? Because it's a country that's always in the news, at least in the U.S., and it's hard to know what to believe, what's really going on, what's not. I saw a week or two ago, Venezuelan troops were crossing the Colombian border. I don't know if that's true or if it's just videos on the internet, but what's going on in Venezuela? What do you see?
Venezuela is an interesting story. I think there was a lot of hope putting in these elections. And I think it's a little bit sad what's going on just because there was real expectation of change, right? And if you follow the Venezuelan story, so the elections stem out from requirements from the Biden administration, actually, with Maduro, to have elections that at least appear to be fair, right? They didn't have to be fair, but they at least appeared to be fair. I think Maduro miscalculated the opposition's resolve and everything that happened after. I don't know how much you follow this, but the whole ballots, how they have all the evidence, how they won the election and whatnot.
I saw briefly, and then I saw he started arresting. I picked up the story mostly when he started arresting the other candidate, right? Like he arrested the other candidate. But what happened before that with the ballots that you mentioned?
So the election occurs. They had these official counters, right? And they gave them these little devices, and they would input the counting for all the boxes into these little devices, and that would be uploaded to the cloud. They have all ballots from all the counting of all the votes, and obviously they have a resolving winning. It's a huge margin. It's uncontestable, right? So
who did Maduro? Who had to win? The opposition.
The opposition, which is this guy, and I don't know how much you are acquainted with Venezuelan politics, but it's this is this lady called Maria Corina Machado. She's been a congresswoman. She's been involved in politics for a very long time, since Chavez was in power. A very, very long time. She was obviously able to galvanize the opposition, consolidate it, because normally the opposition in Venezuela is always fragmented. They say in Venezuela it pays to be an opposition member. It doesn't pay to win the election. It pays for you to be an opposing member of the government, because you'll raise money and you'll live off whatever you're raising and whatnot.
You'll get paid off, basically. The ruling party will pay you to go away.
Yes. Or people that want to believe that you're actually going to do something about it.
Okay.
But I don't want to get too political. The thing is, let's call it, she gets disqualified by the Supreme Court, which is obviously controlled by the regime.
After she wins. So she wins the election.
No, before.
Okay.
Yeah. And they thought, okay, she's going to be out. This is like the banner for the opposition. Yeah. Then she picks up this guy that nobody knows, Edmundo Gonzalez, and somehow she's able to transfer all votes to him. So he ended up running and winning the election. Maduro never thought he was going to be able to actually win the election.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first miscalculation that he did.
Because then he has to decide whether. Then he lost the election, so now he's got to decide what he's going to do.
Yeah. So then you can actually lose the election, but then you can come out and say, hey, I have these figures. He never expected the opposition to actually have the ballots. They had it's called alternative counting system, and they had ballot per ballot. They knew how many votes, and they couldn't. The Maduro government couldn't generate anything. They couldn't show any ballot because they knew they've lost, right? So they just said they tried to hack us from Northern Macedonia, so we cannot show anything. And then one day, I think it was the Supreme Court or somebody, and they say, okay, Maduro won. He just won. He won by 66% or 45%, something like that, and then that's it. We're not going to show any evidence that he won.
And that's where we are now. And they arrested the opposition.
That's where we are now.
What happened to the other guy that a few years ago, I won't remember his name, but that several countries recognized as Venezuela's true president? I think his name is that him?
Guaido.
He was, what happened to him? He's in exile or he's outside of Venezuela. And
I think, again, it pays off. Sometimes it pays off more to be opposition than to actually be president.
Stay in exile at this nice penthouse and shut up.
Yeah. So the last part that I wanted to finish that with is the sanctions, right? So obviously Venezuela is under sanctions. They decrease sanctions or lose them up a little bit, which was benefiting Chevron. Chevron actually asked for some workarounds with the Treasury Department and State Department to be able to operate some of the oil wells in Venezuela. And I also think the Biden administration did this because of the whole Russia conflict. They needed a little bit more oil coming up from south, right?
Well, people forget Venezuela's got the largest oil reserves in the world, right? They have more oil than Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think, it's why it's such an interesting story. Something definitely changed now that Trump's been inaugurated, right? I think Venezuela is too strategic of an asset. It's too close to the U.S. And I don't know how it plays out, but it seems like something big is going to change there sooner rather than later. But then again, I felt that way for 10 years. You've been saying, how can this keep going on? How can this keep going on? And here we are again in, another election and still Maduro.
Yeah. And if you ever go to Cuba, it will give you a lot of context of when you ask yourself, how can this keep going on? Well, Cuba has been keeping going on.
How does it? Is it just corruption and then it's wealthy enough in natural resources and whatever that they can pay enough people off to stay in power?
I mean, it's crazy, right? I think so. I was talking to somebody the other day about this. First of all, so when the Biden administration loosened up the sanctions, a lot of money from oil exports was flowing into the economy. And this has created I don't know how I would even call it. It has created a little bit of fake economic growth because so Venezuela's economy is dollarized, first of all, completely dollarized. You actually go to a restaurant and you pay somebody in a U.S. bank account or in a Panamanian bank account. So you just transfer them money. They'll ask you oh, you have Zelle? Oh, just pay me Zelle on this.
They still use the Bolivar is used for anything or nothing at this point?
Not really, because, the depreciation is so large, right?
So maybe if you have a defined pension or something, they still send you your 1,000 Bolivars a month, but it buys you an egg. Yeah,
they do.
It doesn't buy you anything.
Nothing. I think wages, monthly wages, are around $6 or $12 a month, something like that. It's a
Okay.
crazy amount. I don't know how people survive.
I,
Like for me,
I don't either.
like,
That's one of the things that blows my mind about Venezuela. I don't know how people get by with it. I mean,
and I
it's
think it's
bad.
mostly people sending money from other parts of the world to the
Yeah.
people in Venezuela. And you'll just, hey, I'll pay you with my dollars, right? So you go to a sushi restaurant, there's sushi restaurants. I mean, there's bakeries. So it's like this little microcosm of like a weird country where there's such high levels of just poverty, but also people that are very well off.
That are
And
still that are paying with Zelle on their iPhone because they have a U.S. bank account, right?
that is correct. So it's a crazy thing. But I don't know how much Trump is gonna tighten up sanctions, especially now that Guyana is now pumping actual oil.
Yeah, and there's a bunch more there, right, too. That's another thing Venezuela. I don't know if we talked about it the last time, but there were talks, I don't know, 6, 12 months ago, Venezuela was going to invade Guyana
Yeah, yeah.
because they have all the oil in the equatorial margin, right? No one wants the jungle. They want the offshore oil.
And I think it was the British Navy sent like a ship, like a
Yeah.
warship to just.
Can Venezuela even pump the oil? I mean, can they even drill and set up a new oil field at this point? Or are they pretty dependent on multinationals like Chevron, you mentioned?
They are.
Completely,
They are.
right? So it's.
I mean, I think they might be producing like 200 barrels, something like that. I mean, it's a very, very small amount compared to, or like 20,000 barrels a day, it means nothing. It's nothing.
No,
And they do need like Chevron or somebody else with the pipes because they don't have the equipment, right? The equipment is just gone.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all like in Cuba, right? It's all outdated and broken and they can't get the replacement parts or whatever.
Or the people, because you have a lot of brain drain, a lot of
Oh, at all. Well,
most
that
professional have left.
left a long time ago too, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they had at a
Yeah.
time some of the best petroleum engineers in the world, right? And they're all long gone. They're all in the US doing shale or whatever, Canada. But so what do you think then? I mean, obviously doesn't sound like it's the right time to start looking at Venezuelan assets, but like what are you looking for that'll get you to start digging in and say maybe it's time to, I don't know, buy a Venezuelan bond if there's even one, or maybe get a rental property in Caracas? What are you looking for a sign that maybe might be early days for an investable landscape in Venezuela?
You know, I listened to this podcast and it was this private equity in Venezuela, and they actually came to our office and whatnot. And it's this company, and they're just buying the cheapest assets, but they're still operating. And it's stuff that you actually need. It's like a grocery store,
Yeah.
or like a pharmacy, or it's like a lab, those stuff like that, or like drinks, like a beverage company. And there is this family, and I forget. It's one of the richest families in Venezuela, and they
Okay.
started buying up assets.
Okay. It's interesting. It's like a private equity portfolio with a venture capital mindset, right? They're so cheap, you can probably write it off to zero and say, look, if half the portfolio actually goes out of business, whatever. But if I end up with Venezuela's largest grocery store chain at a 1 price to earnings multiple, I'm going to win anyway.
Just like that. I mean, I'm talking like deep discounts. So they're doing this strategy. The issue is you don't have exit strategy. So you're gonna put in money, but it's money that you have to be ready, like a venture capital. You have to be ready to lose it all.
Yeah.
Or you're gonna make 10x, 20x.
Because even if the operating company pays you a dividend, right, they're paying it in bolivars most likely, right?
Well, a lot of that is dollarized, actually.
Even if the capital structure is Venezuelan, the operating company is a Venezuelan grocery store, they might still convert the bolivars or they accept dollars and they might dividend in dollars.
Or they only take dollars.
Okay, so like at a grocery store in Caracas, you might go in and they might only take dollars.
That is correct.
Interesting. That makes sense. I guess I'm not that surprised, but I would figure maybe there was some enforcement mechanism where you'd be legally required to still take the bolivar.
No, not really.
Yeah.
And I think that's the strange part of Venezuela. Venezuela, it's maybe like Libya, where there is a government, but it's so weak.
They can't enforce. They can't go to a grocery store chain.
War-torn country.
Yeah.
So the enforcement is almost nothing. So yeah, they'll receive payments, but the payments will be in a Panamanian bank account or a U.S. bank account. So you don't even have the money from that structure. It's not even in Venezuela. You don't even have to move it out of the country. It's actually.
Do you think Venezuela, like let's say Maduro's gone and things start to get normal. Let's say they don't even get a Milei or a Bukele. They just kind of muddle along, but it's so down. Do you think in 10 years we can be talking about Venezuela as like a normal Latin American country with an investment market, or is it so far gone that it's going to be a tough situation for a long time?
No, I don't think so, actually. I mean, obviously the country has been run down to rubbles, basically, right? Obviously, there's people that still live there that are very wealthy. There's people that live there that own 20 apartments,
Yep.
and they still have like a vested interest, right? I think if there's actually a change in environment, obviously there's going to be a transition because things have been done a certain way for such a long time that
Yeah.
you're going to be going
Yeah.
kind of against the current, right? There's basically, it's like a lawless place.
Yeah.
Although I've heard it's pretty safe now, but I don't know how true is that. But I do think you have a change and you probably are going to have like, stronger relationship with the US. You might have like an IMF deal where you're going to have strong oversight and whatnot. And you still have a huge oil reserve
Yeah.
and that can flow into the economy so fast.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. If they get their oil industry up and running within a year or two, you could be with one of the biggest oil producers in the world paying dividends back to the sovereign. And if the sovereign's well run, that makes sense.
But again, think about rule of law. If you buy a company, like the transfer of the assets, the judiciary, who's going to be your judge? Or
the private equity strategy you mentioned, right, too. The reason I thought of it as first, it's a venture capital thing because you don't even really know if you own it, right? Like Maduro could come in and just say, you don't own this anymore. There's a company I follow the Gruma. It's the largest corn tortilla producer in the world. It's a Mexican stock. And they've had ongoing litigation for expropriation against Venezuela for like 12 years. And it's interesting because like you always hear about, this country's going to expropriate my assets. Investors always talk about it. But there's not very many cases of like an ongoing international legal dispute of a government expropriating an asset. And they expropriated, I don't know, a bunch of factories in Venezuela. And it's been ongoing. There's, I don't know, all kinds of conventions and treaties and the legal thing's been going on for 12 years. But it's an interesting one to follow. But they do expropriate assets. I mean, if you're investing in Venezuela, it's happening.
Of course.
Yeah. So it is a risk there. But interesting. It's a sad story. It's a fascinating story. I like to follow it. I mean, I hope one day I can go to Venezuela. I've never been, and I'd like to visit and, I don't know, hopefully look for real estate on a beach or something one day if it's investable.
Same here.
We'll see, man. So what else? Is there anything we didn't cover before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I think if I would just add something up real fast, I think the Colombian and Brazilian story, both of the countries are interesting. They have left-leaning presidents, but the corporates, especially in high yield, they're extremely interesting. A lot of them trade in dollars and their revenue sources are in dollars. So the volatility of the sovereign allows you to have better entry points. And I would tell investors those two countries are going to have a lot of corporations issuing high yield debt or that have issued high yield debt that you're probably going to get close to double-digit returns without, risking that much because it's very strong balance sheet. But I think the story for 2025 is going to be Argentina.
More Milei, more reforms. It really starts to filter through to the economy, you think?
Yeah, Milei's I believe he's going to tap the international market. They haven't tapped those since Macri was in power. So it's been a while. They did the whole reform. I think inflation now, it's around 2% month over month, which is, compared to what it was before, it's crazy.
It's a big success for people that think 2% a year in the U.S., 2% a month might think it's crazy, but compared to what it was, that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah. Before it was like between 10 and 15% month over month. So think about that.
It's unlivable. You just spend. Yeah, it was. I was there in November of 2022 at peak inflation, and it was pretty crazy. There's a line like when you have inflation like that. There's a book about Weimar Germany, When Money Dies, and one of the things it said that I didn't really believe was that when you have inflation like that, the restaurants and all the entertainment stuff is packed because people kind of just leave hedonistic lifestyles, right? If I can't save for tomorrow, I might as well just spend all my money today on a nice steak. So we were going around Mendoza, and we went to a couple nice restaurants, and I'm like, dude, how is everyone affording this? 2-week waits to get into certain restaurants when Argentina's country was collapsing. But I guess if you can't save and it's inflating at 15% a month, you better spend it, right?
Yeah. Do you have prices in the menus, or they didn't have their prices in the menus? Because they didn't leave those out because the prices changed so fast.
I forget because I was also, I don't know. Sometimes they put like the magic marker on the menus and they can erase it and then just write it again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But that's a different story than El Salvador, right? Because if they get an IMF package, it is a much more investable market, right? Argentina has an equity index. They have, 60 million people. They've got an agro business, wine exports. It's much more investable in terms of practicality. You can find more Argentine investments than you can in El Salvador. So that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I think if they're actually able to, stabilize the economy in 2025 or whatnot, I believe Milei has like a clear path to dollarize the economy also. He wants to leave the Argentine peso. I don't know if he's going to be successful at doing it, but it looks like he's going to try. For me, an interesting trade is the Argentinian banks. Those all have ADRs, so those are US listed also. So they trade in dollars. You don't have to take the currency risk buying the peso. But the Argentinian banks actually should all benefit from an increase in the credit, an expansion of the credit activity. Just think about the reference rate in Argentina was like, or is, I think the last time I checked was 120%. So that's, like a short-term account where you're going to store some money is going to generate 120%. It sounds great, but the inflation was like 117%. So, I mean, you were just barely recovering,
big numbers for a 3% real yield, right?
Exactly. But I do think the banks should benefit. And I think money should start flowing into the economy. There's so many businesses in Argentina that is a completely different story than El Salvador. There's a lot of corporations that would be interested in tapping international markets. Obviously, you need some sort of certainty of what's going to happen with the economy, right? Especially with if it gets dollarized or not, and what's going to happen to inflation, and what's going to happen after Milei. You never know.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be watching the midterm elections or whatever they call them in Argentina, right, to see if his party can win seats or maintain. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have any read on that.
Same here.
Yeah, it's interesting too, though. Like, last point, I feel like Argentina compared to like Venezuela, or we talked about like all the immigrants that left El Salvador years ago. I don't feel like Argentina suffered the same brain drain. Maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of get the impression that, their education system was still kind of, even at the worst points in Argentina, their higher education system was still pretty well respected. Like they had a very literate country. So I kind of feel like there's a lot of human capital trapped in Argentina that if the government gets out of the way, you could really see a mini boom.
I agree with you, especially they have great teachers, they have great universities, and I think the education there is pretty cheap. You can still go. I remember I was listening to, maybe it was your podcast where I was listening that you could go to Argentina for free, get education, and go back to Brazil.
You want to get controversial? You want to get Argentinians mad? Start talking about all the Brazilians that come and get free healthcare and then just leave. Because Brazil limits the number of seats for their medical schools. So there's only like 50,000 seats in Brazil. So whoever can't get into Brazilian medical school goes to Argentina for free.
Yeah. So there it is.
Yeah. There it is. So we'll see. He's talked about, that's been a political issue, though. It is actually like an issue. He can't, like, he talks all the time about closing that loophole.
Yeah.
Because
the thing is, there's so many entitlements in Argentina. I think it's an excess of entitlement. So it's almost like fake demand that's been pushing this huge inflation.
And you don't know what's real demand and what's not. It's so much misallocation that you don't know what's a grant coming from 100%. Some weird organization, what's real demand. But I'm with you. I think it's going to be a great story to follow this year, too. I think it's a positive story, for sure.
Especially for the risk taker, because, I mean, it's going to be a risky story, too.
Yeah. Cool, man. So where can listeners find you on the internet? LinkedIn, where should I send them? Where can they learn more about MMG and what services you guys offer?
Yeah, I've been getting more active on my LinkedIn. I promised myself for 2025 I was going to be more active on LinkedIn. So I've been doing that a whole lot more. I'll be talking more about our services in the bank also there too. So we offer, it's a full suite of a bank that offers full suite of services, but everything that's focused towards the capital market. So we invest for corporations, and we have corporations, institutions, insurance companies, and we also have our asset manager. We manage money for third-party clients. That's what we do. I mean, that our mandate is, managing or improving capital markets and capital markets activity for everybody.
Cool. And I'll link your profile and MMG site in the show notes for anyone listening so they can find it easily. Thanks for doing this, Alejandro. We'll catch up again soon.
Thank you, Patrick.